This week, I'm taking you through the process of throwing a bowl in 10 steps. Bowls like this are fundamentally quite simple to make, as part of the process is letting the clay do what it wants to do most as it's quickly spun, and that's to splay outward instead of being kept in a nice straight cylinder, which is partly what makes throwing something like a mug slightly more tricky, in my opinion. But if you'd like to watch a video that shows you how to throw a cylinder in 10 steps, that's a tutorial I've already made, and I'll leave a link to that on screen now and in the description below. Like I said, I think bowls are easier to make, but they're also made in such a different way as compared to a regular cylinder. At least my bowls are. This particular shape is made in a certain way to account for how I'm going to trim them later. But no matter the shape, I think what's most important is the curve on the inside. That's what I focus the most on when throwing these. But I'm also purposefully leaving quite a chunk of clay in the base, so that I can trim a tall foot ring from the excess there. In terms of the curve, we were always taught that if you roll something down the interior form, it should move seamlessly back and forth without its path being diverted by, say, throwing rings that are too intense, or other irregular shapes, such as a flat section towards the bottom, or a hump in the wall itself. My other concern is the lip, as ideally as I'm making many dozens of these bowls, I don't want to have to individually trim the interior or the rim on each of them. And I think when you're learning how to throw pots, it helps being able to master perfecting the interior form at the throwing stage, and not having to rely on fixing it at the turning stage. This isn't to say that you can't trim the insides of your pots, as your goal should be to gain a certain level of technical ability where you're able to throw beautiful curves on the insides of your bowls, without having to rely on fixing them at the leather hard stage. I know that you sometimes see me trim the insides of bowls, but consider being able to throw a proper curve akin to something like mastering your scales when you're learning an instrument. It's one of those basic, important skills, and if you're capable of doing so, it only increases your fluency overall, meaning that you can be more creative, and you don't have a crutch to rely on. There are, of course, other times where, whilst the rest of the pot might be lovely, the clay might be too wet for you to now finish the inside properly, and therefore some trimming has to be done at the leather hard stage. That's fine, but on the whole, if you're making hundreds of bowls and you have to fix the inside of each, you're better off pushing yourself to have the skill to be able to execute it properly during the initial throwing stage. Now, for each of these bowls, I'm using 530 grams, which is about 1 pound, 2.7 ounces. As for the tool set I'm going to use, I like to keep it very simple. So, I've got a chamois leather for fixing the rim, a tool for removing the skirt of clay from around the base of a pot, a ruler just for some initial measuring, a wire for separating the pot from the wheel, a sponge for allocating slip and water into very specific areas, and a sharp curved metal kidney, which I use for finishing the interior shape. This is probably the most important tool of the lot, and you'll find, I imagine, depending on the shape and size of the bowls you're making, that you may need to test out various different kidneys until you find one that suits the shape you're making. You can also use plastic ones or wooden ones, but I prefer these sharp metal kidneys, as they do a much better job at scraping away the slip and leaving a crisp, curved surface. The other tool I'm asked about all the time is my scraper, and it really is nothing special. The handle itself has been glued together twice as it's snapped, and over the years its edge has worn down to be very blunt. Yet it does have a specific shape, as the metal has been worn away, which makes it very good at its job without scratching the wheel too much. I recommend using something wooden if you are just learning how to throw pots, or you can find a turning tool like this online and purposefully blunt the edge. The other incredibly useful tool I have for this is a throwing gauge. This measures the height and width of the pots I make, and it gives me a physical target to aim for as I'm throwing. These specific bowls are 9.5 centimeters tall by 16.5 centimeters wide, and I'll throw the pots until the rim is just beside where this gauge's pointer is. And by setting this, I don't have to measure each individual pot with a ruler. Instead, I throw one, measure it, set the gauge, and then I'm left with this target to aim for. The last tool I'm going to be using for these bowls is a larger sponge. I throw these bowls quickly and often douse them with lots of water as I'm making, and thus a larger sponge just helps to soak out any water left inside before scraping clean and refining the inside shape. So the 10 steps for throwing a bowl is as follows. I begin with the centering. Then there's the opening up, the first pull, the second pull. Then comes the shaping, the scraping clean of the inside shape, refining the rim and chamois leathering it smooth. I then scrape away a portion from the bottom, wire it through, and then lift it away. When learning to make pots, I always found it so helpful to have these steps to follow along with, and I would often write them down and pin them next to me, so that I had a list to follow as I threw. As at the start, it's relatively easy to feel lost in the process, as despite feeling very simple for me now, in fact the entire process is almost subconscious. At the start I found it confusing and could never remember what to do next. So let's get started. The very first step is centering the clay. I take the piece of clay and I firmly throw it against the wheel head so that it's securely stuck against the metal. And for this step I spin the wheel quickly and I use liberal amounts of water. As I'm applying so much force onto the lump of clay, it needs the lubrication. Otherwise the clay will just stick to my hands and the material itself will come off on my fingertips. Now, when throwing mugs, my initial aim when centering was to create a low disc shape, but when centering the clay for a bowl, I want to form it into a taller lump, as the initial shape that's made when opening up the piece of clay is completely different. Yet, when centering clay, I always begin by pressing it down into a disc initially, then I pull it up into a cone, like so, before pressing it down again. This process is called coning, and it helps to further blend the lump of clay, aligning the particles that make it up, and potentially popping any last air pockets that remain. And this is the sort of shape I'm after. Ignore the indent towards the bottom. That's simply from where one of my knuckles is pressing in. It helps at the start if your ball of clay has been patted into a round shape. You also want to throw it down as centrally as you can, as if it's really off to one side. It makes this initial process really much more difficult, as the off-center clay will really influence the movement of your hands, and you'll have to fight so much harder to get it on center, especially if your clay is on the slightly hard side. By the way, the stuff I'm using is quite soft, which makes the clay more malleable and easier to move around at the centering stage. You'll often have this dry pad of clay left over on the wheel head from where the previous pot was sliced off. As long as it isn't covered in slip or water, this will act like glue for when the next piece of clay is chucked against it. Let's go through the centering a bit more slowly. For this entire process, I'm bracing my arms on the wheel tray and I'm leaning my upper body weight onto them to add stability. I begin by shoving the piece of clay down. This lump is then pressed in and coned up. I let the undulating part create a peak and then I press that down. And I'll do this a couple of times until I feel like the piece of clay is really smooth and homogeneous. And now I press down from above to create a flatter surface on top, which will be easier to open up from. And then when I take my hands off, I release them gently. As if at any stage you take your hands off very suddenly, you'll impart a distortion into the piece of clay, potentially undoing all that careful centering you've just done. In fact, this is a rule you should follow the entire time you're throwing on the wheel, especially as the pot begins to take shape. Or what I do, if I need to say grab more water, is that I keep one hand on the piece of clay whilst the other fetches water. This way, I can release the clay suddenly, as my other hand is stabilising it. It's also a good habit to get into, to scrape slip and water off the wheel head to use, rather than getting more from the container itself. The second step is opening up the lump of clay, and this is perhaps the part that differs most from making something like a mug, as the initial opening I create when throwing a bowl is just a small rounded hole like this. The hole itself only accounts for half the depth of the entire lump of clay itself, as I need to leave plenty in the bottom so that there's enough clay to work with to trim into a tall foot. But if you're making bowls with shorter feet, or no foot whatsoever, then you simply press down further. The important thing is keeping the shape curved, even at this stage, as my goal when making these shapes is to create a seamless curve on the inside, meaning that the last thing I want to do is to open it up and create a flat bottom. Otherwise there'll be a flat surface on the inside of my bowls, which means the marble that I roll inside it won't flow back and forth and come to a natural stop. The third step is the initial lift of clay. I press in very firmly around the bottom with my knuckle. This forces clay upward into the wall, which I can then pinch and lift up with the help of my fingers on the inside. This movement compresses a lot of clay upward, and it can often create a subtle undulation in the lip itself, so sometimes I just compress the rim like so to force it back to being on center. When I push my knuckle in towards the bottom, I don't immediately press in and lift up. Instead I push in at the bottom until I know for certain that I've created a consistent indentation all the way around, and then by applying pressure both inside and out in a pinching motion, I lift the clay up, whilst simultaneously being careful to not press down too firmly from the inside, as I don't want to lower the internal floor of the bowl, as by doing so it means I won't be able to trim as tall a foot ring. This process imparts a huge amount of force on the pot, so it has to be wetted properly, otherwise you'll find it's quite common that this thick band of clay just comes off in your hands. As you can see, I'm left with an undulation in the lip here, and so to fix it I simply scrape some slip onto the vessel, and then I clasp my hands around the pot, compressing the rim and forcing it back into a more centered shape. The aim with this first pull isn't to gain a ton of height, rather it's to thin out what is an exceptionally thick band of clay, which will help to make the second pull much easier. and as the shape changes so much during this initial pull, it's rather common that an undulation does develop, especially if you are throwing on the slightly faster side, hence why I use this correction method so often. In the mirror that sits in front of me, I can gauge how tall I'm making the vessel with this first lift, and typically I'm aiming for about 70 to 80% of the height of the pointer. Then in the second pull, I'm actually going to lift it higher than the pointer before shaping it and letting the form gradually lose height as I pull the rim out to the pointer. The last thing I'll say about this first pull is that if you're struggling on moving this much clay in one motion, then simply break it down into 2 steps or 3 steps. But it's also worth trying to move around more clay than you think, to find the limits and to push your boundaries, as with enough control you can often be more forceful than you think. It's very common at the start to be a bit timid and careful, but that's just one side of the spectrum, and you need to destroy pots by being too forceful in order to find the balance. The fourth step is the second pull, and with this one my aim is to pull the shape so that it's higher than the pointer. Thereafter, as I belly the shape out, the extra height will diminish as the walls are brought out closer to the throwing gauge's pointer. This pull is much easier, but I'm still pressing in quite firmly with the outside hand around the very bottom to push up some of that excess clay into the walls, which I can then lift. Again, on the inside I'm being very careful not to push down too firmly, as that would get rid of the heft I need in the bottom for the foot ring of this piece. My fingers on the inside are slightly above where my knuckle is positioned on the outside, and together they pinch and pull up at an even rate, thinning out the thicker walls as the pot gets taller. And I also always spend a moment just compressing the rim to neaten it and to control any subtle movement. The fifth step is shaping, and to do this I brace the wall from the outside with one hand as the other from the inside draws it out towards the throwing gauge's pointer. In fact, that's what I'm watching as I do this, not what my hands are doing, but rather I'm watching where the rim is in relation to the pointer. This step, the shaping, isn't typically something I do in one movement, and it can comprise of a few small pulls too, just to get that last bit of height needed if the rim won't quite reach the pointer. I've slowed down the wheel for this as compared to how fast I was going previously, as the walls are now thinner and the form itself is flaring out quite a lot, which means if I was to suddenly spin the wheel too quickly, the entire shape could simply splay outward and even collapse, the walls slumping over themselves. Instead of using my knuckle on the outside for this step, if I want to pull, I instead use my fingertip, as through it I feel I can gauge the thickness of the walls better. And with the rim at last in the right position, I can press it for a moment and slightly bevel it at the same time. As you shape, the hand on the outside is really important. It's essentially supporting the walls and preventing them from collapsing or slumping downward too much. And with this last lift, I'm really just drawing the shape of the pot I want in space, and I look in the mirror to see the profile I want, not from above itself, as otherwise I have to bend back awkwardly in order to properly see the shape. And with pots like this, really the profile is everything, and through repetition and using the same shape tools, that's what makes throwing the same shape over and over again easier with time. There's of course also moments where the rim isn't tall enough, and there is a way to fix this, especially if the clays become too soft to pull up conventionally. To do this, I wet the walls, and then grasp one entire side of the pot, and collar it in like so, my thumbs and the crook created at the bases of them controlling the rim, so it doesn't buckle and then collapse. This process of tilting the bowl inward and collaring it increases its height by quite a lot, meaning it can then be shaped back out to the pointer. I'll show you this movement from a few angles, as it's quite a difficult thing to describe, and what I should have shot is a side view, as the 8 fingers of my hands are supporting the underside of the bowl, the curved shape, and they're again just supporting everything and keeping the bowl stabilised as I force it through a motion that should normally destroy it. Here the rim is about 3 or 4 millimeters short of the gauge, but after collaring it in like this, it's now about a centimetre above it, and now as the overall shape is taller and narrower, the walls can be gently pulled up as I widen the shape, and the bowl's rim is eased out to be just beside the pointer. The next step, although not in the official list, is sponging out all the water and slip from the inside. This is in preparation for tidying up the interior surface, which is another step that puts a tremendous amount of force on the pot. In regard to sponging the slip and water away, remember what I said about taking your hands or any tools off the clay too quickly. As with the walls overhanging as much as they are now, if you're a bit too rough with the sponge, you can easily distort them. The 6th step in the process is tidying up the inside shape. I begin by scraping the centre of the bowl, clean. Then I brace my hand on the outside wall, soak it with the sponge, and now I'm going to press out firmly with the kidney whilst pressing in with that hand from the outside. In fact, that hand is just remaining as steady as a rock on the outside, and I press in with it wherever I can see throwing rings on the inside, forcing the walls of the pot against that sharp metal edge to create a really crisp, clean surface. I really soak my hand on the outside, otherwise it will just stick to the clay here, but I'm also careful not to get any extra on the inside. I need this hand to glide freely when pressed against the clay. Ultimately, I don't mind if the exterior shape is a bit messy, as once leather hard, it's going to get trimmed excessively. So at this stage, all I care about is the inside shape. With the central portion done, I then glide the tool's edge up the wall of the bowl, pressing out firmly against my hand that's pressing in. What I'm looking for as I do this are the throwing rings on the inside surface. Normally these are places where I can't scrape away the slip, as it's very slightly set back in a throwing ring, and where I see these specifically, I press with my fingers from the outside to push that portion of the wall in just a touch so it comes into contact with the metal kidney on the inside. I'm not looking for an 100% perfectly smooth surface, but the better the curve is at this stage and the neater the rim thereafter, the less time I'll have to spend finishing these at the leather hard stage. So, my supporting fingers are soaked, and then I make sure I've scraped off any excess slip covering the kidney, as otherwise it won't be so efficient at scraping away when used again. It's probably towards the rim where I'm pressing in the most from the outside, as this is the weakest part of the pot, and therefore it's the easiest to press out. I also don't mind if the pot collides with the throwing gauge's pointer, as it's made from rubber, and I'll easily be able to smooth any indentations with the chamois leather in a moment. There's a chance that this process also creates some undulations in your vessel, especially if you lose control at any moment. But there is some amount of correction you can do by scraping away the slip from the outside, but like I mentioned previously, I don't worry about this too much, as the entirety of the exterior of these bowls will be trimmed. At the same time, removing as much slip as possible is helpful, as it means the pot will dry out to leather hard more quickly. Generally speaking, whilst I try to be as accurate as I can when throwing bowls, if they happen to be a millimetre too short, or a millimetre too tall, or a millimetre too wide or too narrow, then I really don't mind. Especially since these pots are going to be trimmed so much, there's a chance that all of them will lose a millimetre or two in height during that process. But as long as they're 95% of the way there at this stage, then I'm happy. Another thing that's just as important is maintaining consistent interior shapes, especially the thickness of the base portion, as it's when I make mistakes with that I tend to trim holes through the bottoms of pots. The 7th step is chamois leathering the rim smooth. Here, I very gently pinch the rim with the chamois leather, which I've soaked in water, and I work the clay into a beveled edge, so that it comes to a sharper, yet still rounded point on the outside portion of the wall. I can also firmly hold the chamois in place to ensure that the rim is properly round, but it's also a good opportunity to assess the thickness of the rim. There's one thing that will really make all your bowls stand out from each other is if the thickness of the rims are different. Some thin, some thick, some blocky and squared off, others rounded without much thought. No matter the finish you choose, if you want the bowls you make to look identical, then that extends to how you choose to finish the rim too. The 8th step is scraping away the slip around the base. By the way, I don't let this clay gather in the wheel tray. Instead, it's immediately thrown into the reclaim bucket I keep directly to my left. I don't want to take away too much, as I could potentially remove width that I need in order to trim the foot itself. And really, my aim here is to create a section of clay that's dry enough for me to be able to lift the pot away from after it's been sliced off the wheel head. If I didn't do this and I just cut the pot off and then tried to lift it away by pressing my fingers into that slippy surface, then I wouldn't really be able to get any purchase on it. The pot would most likely just slip out of my grasp, or even if I did get a hold of it, the slip would make it more difficult to set down without the pot sticking to my hands. The next thing I do is lift my throwing gauge's pointer out of the way. This way I can more easily slide my wire underneath the pot to separate it from the wheel head. This is the 9th step. Now, the good thing is, as the base is entirely solid, if I gently wedge 4 digits into each corner of the base, the fingers evenly spread and the pressure evenly distributed, it should be relatively easy to lift the pot away, as I can press my fingers in quite firmly without worrying about distorting the shape of the bowl above it. I then keep my hands level and gently set it aside. And this is the 10th step. You might notice how I've drawn the wearboards back, so it extends well past the end of the table. As the board gradually fills up, I push it forwards. This way, I never have to try and overextend my reach in order to place the pot down. Instead, it's always very accessible and directly to my right. When you're lifting pots off with your hands and setting them aside, you want to make your setup as comfortable as possible, as generally when I do make mistakes, it's because I'm doing something slightly out of the ordinary. The wiring through itself is simple. I simply keep the twisted metal wire really taut and drag it in one quick, even motion underneath the pot. I then wedge my digits into that dry section I created beforehand, and you'll notice in the exact moment I lift, I also spin the wheel. This breaks the slightly sticky seal there can be. I also make sure that the fingers I'm pressing into the bowl are not covered in slip. And normally, when I'm not filming, I simply scrape the slip off against the sharp plastic edge of this bucket. But in this instance, I dried them fully. This means I'm pressing dry fingertips into a portion of clay I've scraped clean of any slip. Therefore, neither part should really stick to each other. The trickiest thing though with these bowls is simply maintaining stability, as normally, in the moment I lift, the bowl will also want to tilt to either side. You might also get the urge to support the bowl from around the rim, but that's the absolute last thing you want to do, as the rim at this stage is really weak and susceptible to being warped and damaged, whereas the base is solid. So you can press your fingers into it without worrying about it deforming the rest of the shape. In fact, it sort of helps that the base is as thick as it is, as it sort of adds a sturdy foundation to the object, which makes it easier to lift away. And this explains many of the pots you see thrown in the eastern part of the world. They're thrown atop the hump of clay, and often potters leave quite a sizable chunk on the base of each piece, simply as it makes lifting them off easier. I could throw them on bats, but the truth is I can fit more to a board if they're made like this. And space in the workshop is my ultimate bottleneck, so the more bowls I can fit onto each board, the better. Anyhow, this batch consisted of about 80 bowls, all of which are going to be trimmed a tremendous amount, the vessels losing this rather nice curvaceous shape. In many ways, the form you see here is the foundation for the shape to come, but regardless, I hope you found this bowl making video helpful. And it's another video that I can add to my Beginner's Guide series, which is a playlist you might find helpful if you are just learning how to throw on the wheel. Thank you, as always, for taking your time to watch, and I'll see you next week.